to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Eric Batalla. But before I do, as some of you will know, this is our fifth regularly scheduled CERC seminar, counting Dr. Frank Daunt's fine talk last Friday, our sixth even. And we have a couple still remaining this semester. We have a talk scheduled for next week by Wayne Palmer. He will be speaking about migrant workers in Hong Kong from Indonesia. He's currently a visiting scholar at CERC, working on these issues in Hong Kong for an NGO. And then the following month in April, the 14th of April, we have a talk by a well-known young Thai scholar, Prajak Kong Kirati, who will be speaking about electoral violence and democracy in Thailand. But before that, of course, we have Dr. Battalla's talk today. Many of you know Eric, but for those of you who don't, he's full professor and current chair of the Political Science Department at De La Salle University, which, without going into detail, is one of the centers of political science. I won't say the center, but a important center for political science in the Philippines today. And he is a senior fellow of several policy research groups, which is one of the things De La Salle has been doing to enhance its research profile, the Yuchenko Center and the Jesse Robredo Institute of Governments. Of course, Robredo, a famous local mayor who, of course, died very recently. Eric teaches courses on political economy, public policy, and comparative politics. His most recent article on veto players and state decisiveness was published in the Philippine Political Science Journal, which I want to add is now a SSCI indexed journal, so an up-and-coming journal in our field. He was formerly Dean of the School of Management and Information Technology at the College of St. Benilde and the former Vice Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at De La Salle University. He did both his MA and PhD at Hiroshima University in Japan, as well as an MBA and AB History Political Science degrees from De La Salle. Eric, there's a lot more, of course, I could say, but that would take away from your talk time. We're very pleased that you could come today and look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Mark, for the generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen of the City University of Hong Kong, good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Mark for inviting me over and give this lecture at your renowned university. It's been a long time since I've been here. The last time was maybe 2005 when the APISA held its conference here, around here, actually. And so I was delivering or presenting a paper in that conference. For those of you, the APISA is the Asian Political and International Studies Association, which Mark currently heads, right? Well, this afternoon I'd like to present a paper on the policy consequences of the political consequences of policy decisiveness in Southeast Asia. This paper is an offshoot of a previous one, which focused on Japan's economic partnership agreements with three countries, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. The literature on institutions and veto players informs us of certain policy trade-offs in democracies. One such trade-off is elaborated by Gary Cox and Matthew McCubbins, and this trade-off is between decisiveness and resoluteness. This is similar to what Andrew McIntyre wrote some time ago, policy decisiveness and policy rigidity. Another way of looking at this trade-off is to reverse their images as political problems. And from here, you can see that the trade-off is actually between indecisiveness and irresoluteness. indecisiveness meaning the inability to make decisions, and this reflects a divided government, which could lead to, say, unilateralism, in which political actors, say the executive and the legislature, would pursue separate policies. Maybe later on we'll show some cases. And it could also lead to policy gridlocks. In contrast, we have a resoluteness, which is the inability to stick to a decision once made. It reflects a state that finds policy making too easy and therefore allows for decisiveness. The problem here is that because a policy can be easily reversed as soon as they're made, the government or the state might lack the credible commitment. As the literature points out, decisiveness is not simply a character trait of the leader or of the manager. There is a structural basis. Decisiveness depends on the institutional design and political configuration that unite or separate veto players. We follow here the definition of Tseblis, who defines veto players as individual and collective actors whose formal consent is necessary to adopt a policy. Examples would be the President, the Senate, the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, or even a political party. The point I'd like to argue at this point is that while the powers of government may be separated, decisiveness reflects a unity of purpose among veto players. Something like this. Even if the powers are constitutionally separated, they can actually be united. So the question is, who controls the government? So the separation by purpose, as argued in the literature, is electorally determined, which tells us which representatives of government get elected to government, which representatives get elected to government. It is the separation of purpose that determines the effective number of veto players in the system, regardless of the separation of powers. So here, you see here the unified government. It represents a unity of purpose regardless of that separation that we're talking about. And the effective number of veto players is 1 or near 1. There are less checks in the system, and there's the tendency to lack credible commitment. On the other hand, we've got a divided government which is separated by power and even by purpose. And the effective number of veto players is greater than 1, which means more checks in the system and less decisiveness. So McIntyre in 2001, in his work, shows how decisiveness raised the risks for investors in Indonesia and Malaysia during the currency crisis of 1997, 1998. Accordingly, the policy environment became difficult for investors to make decisions, and thus making the Malaysian and Indonesian economies more unstable. Here we see a famous picture where President Suharto was signing the letter of intent while the IMF head, Michel Camdeses, was standing on guard. Well, actually, this was the third time, because whenever Suharto would request for an emergency loan from the IMF, the IMF would give the loan, and then Suharto would use the loan to bail out crony firms and even family firms. So he makes a commitment and then reverses it. So and this did not help capital flight from continuing. The value of the rupiah slid from about $2,000 in July 1997 to a range of about 16 or 10,000 to 16,000 in February 1998. In Malaysia, Mahathir responded to the currency crisis through the unorthodox policy of spending and capital controls, but this did not prevent the economy from continuing to slide. So Mahathir reversed his earlier position and allowed his deputy Anwar, who was serving as finance minister, to resolve the currency crisis. And after gaining the cabinet approval in December of 1997, Anwar took the policy termed orthodox of austerity, helped by the Bank Negara Malaysia and also of the IMF. The policy did not produce immediate positive results, and by the second quarter, he was sacked. Actually, while he was implementing the policy of austerity, Mahathir was also implementing his own policy of bailing out and spending on infrastructure. So there was kind of, it was confusing for the investors. Mahathir was doing this, and the Anwar was doing the reverse. So it became difficult. As McIntyre notes, an investor's comment was that if the capital controls did not work, would the policy be reversed again by Mahathir? So this is just this is the chart given by McIntyre. Now, on the y-axis, you have the policy risk for investors, and on the x-axis, you've got the number of veto players. What the chart says is that the lower the number, if you've got the veto players at the extremes, then the risk for investors is high. So you've got Thailand on the other side, and Indonesia and Malaysia on the other extreme. Thailand had a problem of indecisiveness based on McIntyre's account, and the government was immobilized by a multi-party coalition, unlike in Indonesia and Malaysia, where you've got only one veto player. So the question that I'm trying to address in my paper is, under what conditions does policy decisiveness become politically costly? And I put this question in the context of the bilateralism that swept the 2000s. Bilateral free trade agreements are preferential trade agreements. Could be done between two countries, let's say the United States and Malaysia, or between a country and an economic bloc, for instance, ASEAN and China, or between two economic blocs. In Southeast Asia, bilateral FTAs were embraced with mixed enthusiasm. Some joined FTAs or engaged in FTAs out of fear of being excluded from major markets, say China or Japan. or it could be as an initiative, just like Thaksin's FTA policy, or as a response to strategic diplomacy, as in the case of the Philippines. I used three cases: Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines in the 2000s. One is a relatively stable government, considered by some in this room as semi-liberal, a semi-democracy or a liberal democracy. And Thailand and the Philippines represent fragile democracies. All of these countries have somehow liberalized, but not fully, their economies. And in the 2000s, they were governed by strong leaders who have exhibited decisive postures, policy postures. In all these countries, the bilateral negotiations were conducted under the veil of diplomatic secrecy. Just to give you a fast forward, this chart is a comparison of the negotiations and outcomes involving the economic partnership agreements with Japan. As you can see, you've got Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The effective number of veto players in Thailand and Malaysia was 1, and in the Philippines there were 3, comprising the President, the Senate for treaties, and the Supreme Court, which has the power of judicial review. Was it the first bilateral for Thailand? No, but it was for Malaysia and the Philippines. Was there lack of transparency? There was in all countries. Lack of public consultations? Yes, in all countries. Was the legitimacy of the executive questioned? The legitimacy of the executive to conclude or ratify the economic partnership agreement? Yes, it was questioned in Thailand and the Philippines, but not in Malaysia. Did the economic partnership agreements affect politically sensitive sectors? Yes, in Thailand, it affected agriculture, the automobile industry, and the environment. In Malaysia, of course, among others, but more particularly the automobile and steel industries. In the Philippines, yes, the environment, the automobile industry, and there were also constitutional issues. The political outcomes in terms of domestic politics, in Thailand there was an erosion of trust in the executive, although not directly causing the coup d'etat, but it somehow contributed in the disenfranchisement of the Prime Minister. In Malaysia, there was pressure on the cabinet of Abdullah to alter the decisive style. In the Philippines, there was an erosion of trust in President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo because of the Japan-Philippine Economic Partnership Agreement. So with that, let's go to the to each of the 3 cases at length. Thailand was the FTA activist. It was very active in negotiating and concluding bilateral free trade agreements, given Thaksin's hands-on CEO style of management. The FTA policy of Thaksin was designed to accelerate the recovery of the domestic economy while integrating it with the international system. And there's also mention in the works written that he was positioning to be a statesman of the ASEAN as well. During his time, from 2001 to 2006, there were at least 13 bilaterals proposed and negotiated. So here's a table. There were about 6 bilateral FTAs signed during the Thaksin administration, with Peru, Australia, China, New Zealand, Bahrain, and India. And there were also FTAs negotiated and proposed, but which were either discontinued or were still undergoing negotiations. One was signed, the one with Japan was signed by the successor government of Surayud. What was the political configuration? Oh yeah, by the way, even until March 2006, Thaksin was busy negotiating and proposing FTAs. The political configuration that made Thaksin decisiveness possible could be traced with the founding of the Thai in 1998. As you know, in 2001, TRT won about half of the total number of seats in parliament, and with the coalition government with Chartai and also the National Aspiration Party, it gained the majority. And in 2005, it won a landslide victory with about 75% of the total number of seats in parliament. This victory signified a unified government led by Thaksin, who can now freely pursue his bilateral FTA agenda. But there was an institutional design issue in the Constitution, particularly. We find Article 224, which states that the king has the prerogative to conclude a peace treaty, armistice, and other treaties with other countries or international organizations. And it also says that a treaty which provides for a change in the Thai territories or the jurisdiction of the state or requires enactment of an act for its implementation must be approved by the National Assembly. So this article actually is controversial because in the light of the Thaksin's FTA activism, because it suggests at least one more veto player when it comes to international agreements. When in practice, it was really Thaksin who was ratifying. He was the sole veto player. It became controversial in such that when Thaksin was ousted and the new constitution was prepared, there was a kind of correction, and this could be found in section 190, which provides for greater transparency and participation in treaty making. What were the benefits and costs of the bilateral FTAs? Definitely it provided some benefits to Thai firms, especially exporters and some domestic traders. But it also taxed the bureaucracy's negotiating capacity and resources because of the sheer number of the agreements being negotiated. But sometime in 2004, a deal with China brought real losses to fruit, onion, garlic, fruit, and vegetable farmers in northern Thailand because of cheaper imports flooding the Thai market. That was the first manifestation of the costliness of the bilateral FTAs. And because of this, the certain sectors like the dairy industry reacted. So here, dairy farmers protested against ongoing negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. So it fueled opposition and public suspicions of the selling of Thailand. So that image was being cultivated in the public mind, given the lack of transparency in the negotiations. Then Sometime in 2006, I think it was early 2006 or late 2005, there was a negotiation between the United States and Thailand for the sixth round in Chiang Mai. And in the middle, then suddenly at night, the protesters sieged the venue, in the hotel venue in Chiang Mai, and the negotiators escaped in the middle of the night. The protesters included those who, of course, anti-FTA activists and farmers, and even HIV victims, because the agreement covered certain sensitive industries, including pharmaceuticals, agriculture, finance. So anyway, there was a rapid erosion of public trust, especially after the Shin-Temasek deal. As you know, the Temasek is Singapore's investment arm, and the selling of Shin Telecoms to a foreign company was very sensitive in Thailand at the time. Anyway, there was a coup in 2006, and that was the end for at least for Thaksin. The story of Malaysia is one of initial reluctance to being active and then to being cautious. There was at first a hesitation during Prime Minister Mahathir's term to join any bilateral agreement because of the advocacy for strong Asian economic blocs. But at any rate, Mahathir finally agreed when he saw that Thailand and the Philippines were racing for a bilateral economic partnership agreement with Japan. He agreed, and sometime in late 2002. He was succeeded by Abdullah, who became active in pursuing bilateral FTAs. He found an opportunity to open up Malaysia. So 2 out of 8 bilateral trade agreements were entered into force during Abdullah's term. But as I will show you later, brakes were applied sometime in 2006. So here's the table of the bilateral FTAs initiated under Abdullah. There was Japan. Negotiations launched in January 2004 and was entered into force in 2006. There were others, but I'd like to point out the particular case of Japan and the United States. As you can see, the point here in this table is that Abdullah was actually moving towards more bilateral free trade agreements. So the institutional configuration. So like Thailand, Malaysia is a constitutional monarchy, but with an elected king. Well, I'm no Malaysian expert, but this is what, who no longer has veto power, and I learned this from Bill Gates as a result of legislation in the 1980s. There's the bicameral legislature, the Dewan Rakyat and the Dewan Negara. But as I understand it correctly, the Senate can only delay passage, but it's not a veto player. Judiciary independence has been questioned since Prime Minister Mahathir and the UMNO forced out the Lord President and other judges of the Supreme Court. So virtually leaves the executive as the veto player. The Barisan Nasional is the majority coalition, but UMNO which receives the support of the Malay majority, dominates that coalition and the government. Up to 2004, it held about 2/3 of the seats in parliament. The party enjoys relative stability despite occasional straying points, such as the Mahathir Razale and Mahathir Anwar divisions. Sorry. So, the cabinet is headed by the Prime Minister, who dominates. Headed by the Prime Minister, who dominates policy making. However, we observe also that since 2008, the orientation of power has shifted from the Prime Minister to the UMNO Supreme Council. But at any rate, during the time of the bilateral negotiations, it was the cabinet. So, I mentioned that the Abdullah government was initially active in pursuing bilateral FTAs, but then suddenly brakes were applied and it became more cautious. So we ask why, and maybe the experiences of the economic partnership agreement with Japan and also the United States could provide some answers. So, the agreement with Japan, so even despite the hesitation by the Mahathir government, formal negotiations were started in early 2004, and it was concluded very quickly in October 2005, signed in December and entered into force on July 2006. The negotiations were being led by Rapida Aziz, whose picture is there, who is the head of the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. There were sensitive issues in the negotiations, and one of the issues was the steel and automotive industry. And here there was a political rift between Mahathir and Abdullah. Mahathir being a director of Proton, after resigning from his post as Prime Minister, he was director of Proton, but also because the automotive industry was his baby. But because of the Jamepa, the Prime Minister Abdullah had to open up the car industry. So yes, during the negotiations, Mahathir even charged the government of corruption, of excessively granting automobile permits, which undermine the automotive industry. So, because of the Jamepa, after the signing of the agreement, there was a demand among party members and even members of parliament for oversight, parliamentary oversight. There was also a demand among UMNO party members and civil society for more transparent and participation in decision making. And this change in behavior could be found in the U.S. Malaysia Talks. President Bush was given a fast-track authority by the U.S. Congress to make bilateral agreements up to July 2007, and the negotiators were assured by Rapida that there will be no political obstacles to a U.S.-Malaysia free trade agreement. But there was open resistance by NGOs, and government became more sensitive to domestic political resistance to the negotiations. There were at least 52 unresolved issues which the government decided not to fast track due to the treaty's political contentiousness. So there was a kind of, more vocal resistance in the U.S.-Malaysia talks than in Japan. So while negotiations were being made, the Deputy Prime Minister Najib announced that the cabinet has decided that the meeting will no longer spearhead the negotiations, but it will allow the various ministries to negotiate separately, which virtually means that the deadline will not be met. So that was the problem then. What was the cost to Abdullah of the bilateral free trade agreements? Even if he received a fresh mandate during the 2008 elections, the political party, the dominant party, performed dismally. Its total number of seats it received 63% the total number of seats in 2008. And this led to calls within the party, led by Mahathir, for his resignation. Of course, he didn't resign immediately, but Mahathir did. and said that he will only return if Abdullah resigns. There were more defections from Barisan Nasional, and this somehow led to Abdullah to resign. Actually, I don't know if the Supreme Council forced the Prime Minister to resign in October. For the Philippines, it was the first comer attempt. It was the least active among the three in terms of forging bilateral trade agreements. The Philippines has a greater number of effective veto players. As I mentioned, it has the President, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. The table shows that it only had 2 bilateral partners or agreements on the table, and Japan being the first and the last during the decade. So, like Taksin, GMA was a strong leader, and projected decisiveness with respect to the bilateral EPA. In May 2002, she proposed to Koizumi the creation of a working group to study the prospects of that economic partnership agreement. Formal negotiations were started in February 2004, and the framework agreement was signed in November. And 2 years later, both Koizumi and Arroyo signed the agreement. But see here, the ratification by the Senate came 2 years later. Initially, going to the political configuration, initially the Arroyo administration enjoyed the strong support of a strong coalition. But after the Hello Garci scandal, the Liberal Party, which was her ally before, broke from the coalition, and that meant about 4 senators out of that coalition. So because of that, the Senate became more identified with the opposition, but the lower house was still dominated by the government party or coalition, the Lakas Kampi. So when they were negotiating for the JPEPA, during the negotiations, the Arroyo government could manage to work out on those issues, which included even environmental and constitutional issues. However, after the signing of the agreement, there was a problem with the Senate. There was an initial tussle regarding whether the Senate has the authority to ratify free trade agreements. And of course, it was later decided that the Senate does have the authority to ratify the free trade agreements because the JPEPA falls under what we call the WTO plus kind of agreement. If the provisions fell under the WTO, then the Senate would not have to ratify it. Unfortunately, the text of the agreement was not released to the public, even after the signing. So the environmentalists led the charge along with the champion, the Senator Cayetano, making the charge that toxic wastes will be dumped. And so public opinion was formed against the agreement. And the Senate forced the agreement to be delayed, in terms of ratification, and it subjected that agreement to public consultations and debates. It was only an exchange of notes between Japan in 2008, assuring that the Philippines will not violate existing environmental laws and constitutional provisions, that the Senate decided to ratify. So what were the political consequences for the Arroyo administration? Arroyo's hurry to have a deal with Japan heightened public suspicions about the integrity of the government. So the executive handling of the negotiations was discredited. So by the time of the Senate ratification, the government has been embroiled as well in several corruption-related scandals, like the deal with the ZTE, NBN, as well as the fertilizer fund scam. It was also mentioned that the Supreme Court, if, for instance, the agreement was enforced, that the Supreme Court would veto the agreement. So let me wrap up by saying that Malaysia and Thailand were more decisive than the Philippines because of the unity of purpose in government. Decisiveness towards FTAs and the EPAs, combined with diplomatic secrecy, eroded public trust and produced government instability. But the Philippine case showed decisive executive posturing, but was constrained by the Senate and the public, even if the agreement became more credible later on. What we can say is that in all the three countries, the international negotiations did not consider domestic ratification constraints, which was pointed out by Robert Putnam. International negotiations involve a two-level game. one at the international level, and the second at the domestic level, where where informal and formal actors have to be dealt with by the negotiators. We also know the importance of procedure in making bilateral free trade agreements. That is to include in the equation not only the question of diplomatic secrecy, but consultations, the importance of public consultations, and if possible, some transparency. Know that three countries bypassing domestic ratification constraints proved to be costly to all the administrations. But some, more than the others, just like in Thailand. I did not cover Indonesia. I should have, but because of lack of time and resource constraints. Because Indonesia, the bilateral agreements in Indonesia were not much of an issue. The president, Yudhoyono, the government of Yudhoyono was able to sign the economic partnership agreement with Japan without much political fanfare. And yet, about 10 years earlier, the decisiveness in Indonesia was very controversial. Here in Indonesia, the bilateral partnership agreement did not require parliamentary or legislative ratification. It only required the signature of the president. So, well, these are my references. Thank you for sharing your time.
Thanks very much, Eric. Are there questions? Well, while others are gathering their thoughts, Eric, let me just see if I'm following you. So, on the one hand, you're saying that in the Philippine case, the relative indecisiveness contributed, in a sense, to helping legitimize the agreement because people felt like they had more opportunity to intervene through one of the three veto players.
Yes.
And so the argument is when you sort of ram things through in a policy sense, opposition builds up that ultimately backfired on both Thaksin and Abdullah.
Yeah.
But then that leads, and that seems to be a pretty clear lesson, and I was, it's like one of those fairy tales where you have a nice moral lesson at the end, be more open, be more transparent. But then we have the case of Indonesia, which you sort of threw in at the end. Can you maybe, you seem to have a generalization, but then the Indonesian case, does it cast doubt on that? And if so, what maybe is the generalization after we take into account Indonesia, or does that make it difficult to generalize?
I think it depends on the leader. Yudhoyono was less controversial. I don't know, but Yudhoyono is not like Gloria Arroyo after the Hello Garci. I wonder if the Hello Garci scandal, election scandal, didn't happen, and the Liberal Party was still within the coalition, maybe the economic partnership agreement would have been ratified much earlier. Thaksin, of course, was very controversial.
Yeah. Can I just, quick follow-up then. So maybe the point is, the generalization is policy decisiveness by controversial leaders will not go well. And one could really make that argument about Thaksin more generally. That, he was in many ways, I think viewed objectively, one of the most effective leaders Thailand has had in a very long time. And yet there have been few Thai leaders who are as unpopular, as have aroused as much opposition, intransigent opposition, as he has. And therefore, if you have a controversial leader, it's best to, as in the Philippine case, in other words, the way that the Philippines was able to solve that problem of a unpopular though decisive leader was to let people have the impression through the various veto actors that they'd had their say.
Yes, to open up the process, let people know more about what's happening.
So if I may say so, the country that comes out looking best in this is the Philippines.
Actually, I was pointing to Indonesia.
Well, unless you're blessed with a popular leader, although that only lasts for a short period, as we know. That would not be true today at the end of his term.
So what? It's curious because some people say it's because of the structure, but then the cases actually point out that there were decisions made by the leaders that led to the political contentiousness, of their bilateral policy, or the in the case of Gloria Arroyo, if there were certain contextual variables, if the text of the document were released to the public earlier, there would not have been public suspicions, or a negative public image created, because in the absence of the transparency, the environmentalists made the charge.
Yeah.
They said, "Oops, toxic wastes are going to be dumped."
Sure. Can I? And this is, and then I promise to shut up. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? So why this compulsive secrecy in all three cases, right?
They were all starting out.
But why did they so blatantly disregard this obvious factor of domestic? Can't explain that. Is it just the nature of free trade agreements that one assumes the public won't like them or something?
Yeah, maybe. Especially because of course, we have the long-standing debate between economic protectionism and liberalization. But maybe it also has something to do with diplomatic relations and how they're conducted. Diplomatic secrecy. Yeah. Bill.
Yeah, these institutional configurations, they seem to change over time. And so you might be decisive at one point and irresolute, and then you might be indecisive and more resolute sometime later. How would you characterize Malaysia today? And the reason I ask that question is because it's the only country, I think, in Southeast Asia that's involved in negotiations over the TPP. And they are deeply secretive. No participant in these discussions is willing to share any of the details with their respective mass publics at this stage. So I'm wondering, is Malaysia today less decisive than it used to be under Najib? Which would mean then, I guess, that the weaker he is as a leader, the more prospect he has of making any deal that he strikes actually stick. And so I'm thinking that it's most improbable that the TPP is going to finally get through the Malaysian parliament.
Maybe what's happening, as I hinted earlier, I'm not an expert on Malaysia, but I think now the cabinet is less decisive, and it has to ask the permission or get the approval of the Supreme Council, because on bilateral agreements.
Is it possible for Malaysia at this juncture to be both indecisive and irresolute? It can be. Because that's increasingly the way it's looking to me. I must say, which bodes very poorly, actually, for the TPP. So can you update this framework just a bit and maybe apply it to? Because this is probably the most important multilateral negotiation underway anywhere in the world just now. So I'm wondering, does this have any application to that? Your framework here? Can you make any predictions based on your understanding configurations of different governments in the region and maybe what's likely to happen to this partnership?
To the TPP.
Yes.
No, I haven't studied the TPP. I promise I'll study the TPP. But
But you can't because it's not transparent.
But if you've got a powerful model, you don't need to study it beforehand.
There are more
Contextual
actors.
variables. You should be able to.
There are more actors in the TPP. There are more countries involved. And
Right,
when I was
sure.
in Japan, there was a strong sense among people that I talked to that the agricultural sector, of course, is against it. Although we're beginning to see the promotion of Japanese agriculture on CNN, so which might be an indication. But there's a strong sense of resistance because the term used was it will decimate the countryside. So that's for Japan. I don't know about Malaysia, but it could be.
Malaysia's more
With
worried
the-
about the procurement.
Procurement, the
Procurement
foreign
is-
national, it has been always the issue. Procurement.
The thing that you just point out, I mean, it seems like maybe the content of the free trade agreements could be more important. I mean, a CENA, because the trade between countries are more complementary, the public doesn't, discontent is not as much. But when you have bilateral country to country and it affects agricultural, or in the case of Malaysia, the automobile, I mean, it makes sense that the public rise up. Yeah. Whereas in Vietnam, for example, you have bilateralism and they have a lot. But it doesn't really affect any particular sector negatively. No one
will.
speak out.
All right. In the case of the automobile in Malaysia, one reason why it became less contentious later on was because there was a promise of compensation. If there was no compensation for the automobile industry, it would be highly contentious. And so Japan promised that Malaysian automotive industry will be a regional hub, and they promised to give more trainings to the local firms. So it's always like that. If you're going to be affected, what compensation will be given? So maybe.
Well, in that case, do you think Japan does a better job than the United States in terms of giving compensation to a particular sector that may be hurt through trade?
Yes, it might be in a better position than the United States, since government can work more strategically.
But that would then also mean that your model becomes more complex, right? Because it would depend on who the free trade agreement is with and how many, in what sector. Like for instance, can you give, maybe you've already pointed at that, but can you give us an idea? So in your model, the one that has had most free trade agreements seems to be Thailand, right? And it went well until Thaksin started had that agreement on fruit and trade, if I am not mistaken.
Actually, there was kind of compensation given to the farmers in northern Thailand. Somehow, so this one town, one product is one of the measures undertaken by Thaksin, which somehow mitigated the political impact. Except that, there were people who were really against Thaksin from the very start. And of course, so they could be used to discredit the bilateral free trade agreements.
Just as a small
Yes,
follow-up,
yes.
is there any country over the board that is disliked for the free trade agreements, or can you point to a line like Japan? Is that usually okay, or like yeah, like
I don't think many countries are ready for a free trade agreement. So, but it depends on which sectors are covered by the trade agreements. If the sectors are politically sensitive, then maybe what compensation will be given for those who will be affected. That should be part of the negotiation.
So are you also saying, just to follow up on
Yes.
the conversation, are you also saying that if a country who has election and have divided government, it's more likely that the opposition will use the bilateral to target?
Depends on the electoral outcome. See here, even in Taksin, we had 75% of parliament. The conservatives were really against from the very start.
Right.
So it could be made as an issue, but then if there were problems in the procedure or in the process, that could contribute to the costliness of the outcome.
So in the case of Indonesia, why is it so? Is because, can you give more reason why you think Indonesia has done well and not face these issues like Malaysia?
I think there was really a big compensation package. The negotiations did not touch on very sensitive sectors that Indonesia. So
What about opposition?
and also the standing of the president, something to do with the public acceptance of the agreement. So it's kind of fluid. As I mentioned, even in the Philippines, if President Royo wasn't embroiled in that election-related scandal, the deal would have been immediately ratified by her coalition in the Senate. But since the Liberal Party, her former ally, decided to bolt out of the coalition, so that cost the Arroyo government 2 years. And hence it was not able to reap what it intended to have, which is the first comer advantages of having an agreement with economic partnership agreement with Japan.
Would you have any explanation for Indonesia, this most successful of liberalizers and negotiators? Why has it become so economically nationalist today? It's going through an extremely protectionist mood just now with respect to its natural resources sector in particular.
Yes.
But how might the configuration have changed to produce an outcome like that? I mean, that seems to be quite a significant shift.
Yeah. I want to study Indonesia more closely, precisely ask the same kind of questions that you're asking. I could only hypothesize right now that President Bambang, Susilo Bambang, is less controversial, and that the Indonesians also see no problem with the economic partnership agreement with Japan. That's why it was signed without any political controversy. I don't know about other bilaterals that Indonesia is currently negotiating. Of course, the economic nationalism is very strong in Indonesia. But which sectors would they allow to be liberalized? Are probably those sectors that have been liberalized more or less already. And of course, what would be the compensation package if the deal would really affect certain basic sectors?
Can I have a little comment? Like for instance, a few months ago, the price of soybeans rose, or the rupiah decreased, and that caused the price of soybeans to rise, and that caused some kind of, like you were saying, economic trouble, because a lot of it was grown in the United States. So people in Indonesia were saying, this is our staple food, tempeh, and it's basically made from soybeans, and now we have to pay more for it because the rupiah is weaker and it's in the United States. So your point, these issues are sensitive, and the government does pay attention to it, because otherwise people will...
Isn't that true with garlic too? Was it garlic or onion?
Soybeans. I think.
Ah, it was something less significant than that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, they've given it to the United States, and now people are sort of unhappy.
I promise I'll study Indonesia more closer.
And the TPP too, while you're
You have to pay for it.
We send you away with assignments. I mean, if I can just follow up on a couple of things that have been said about this model. I mean, on the one hand, in the discussion of leadership, you stressed a lot. But also, of course, the politics of economic protectionism. And you said something very interesting about Indonesia. You know, the smart negotiator negotiates things that already have been liberalized. So you're not having to really give away anything. You decided to do that on your own, and then you say, by the way, to your partner, this is liberalized, so we can agree to that. But if one assumes that these trade agreements involve in the classical economic trade-off between, you know, vested interests on the one hand and general economic, you know, growth on the other, and the problem with growth is it's distributed in a different way than the particular benefits. That you know, one would sort of need to map the sort of protectionist map, and following that up, of course, what one generally says is Thailand is generally seen as one of the least protected of the Southeast Asian countries. I don't know if you would agree with that assessment, but that's often one hears in literature. So the interesting thing is, even though Thaksin has a economy that's relatively open, because he's such a controversial leader, even his attempts to, you know, tweak the liberalization a bit more lead to all this all this controversy. And so that, you know, one would expect sort of in the Thai case that be an easy one. And if there had been a less controversial leader, probably it would have been. Yeah. But then that shows that in that case the crucial variable was the leader. That even though and even though he did actually quite, as you say, quite cleverly target certain groups that should have been happy with the compensation, because his political opponents were looking for any. This is one sees now, but one forgets this has been going on since the earlier Thaksin period, that the opponents are always looking for something to get him with. So that, I mean, in terms of the model, that strikes me as, you know, you have these sort of background conditions, but very contingent factors related to the leader himself or herself.
Because Thaksin was virtually an authoritarian because of the political configuration.
Well, that's what his
because of the political configuration, they couldn't make the opposition in parliament cannot contest.
Right.
Right, and that's one of the.
But they did have a military that was able to contest.
Yes, and in Indonesia, this also the same thing. Even the Philippines, the military factor should be included as a factor, you know, in explaining the differences in political outcomes.
And but just to follow this thought further, then if it had not been for Hologarci, I mean, then the question is, what would have happened in the Philippine case? I mean, Arroyo would have faced fewer obstacles, but then would the agreement have been less
controversial?
It would also have been less controversial. So again, the very contingent character of Arroyo, I mean, that one could not predict this in a model, that Arroyo is going to be caught red-handed manipulating the 2004 election. So it's, you know, it's a relief actually for those who are skeptical about models to find out that that we have to have all these contingent factors anyway.
also the importance of the contextual variables.
Right, well, if there are no further questions, again, thank you, Eric, and thanks to the audience for the questions.
Thank you very much.